Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, the ticket that's shocking the Democratic Party back to life.
Are you ready to go out and make sure that Kamala Harris and Tim Walz win?
Will Kamala Harris's vice presidential pick keep the campaign's momentum going? I'm Malika Bilal, and this is The Take.
I am Carri Twigg. I am currently in Los Angeles. I co-founded and run a film and TV production company, but I spent 15 years working for elected officials at every level, most lastly in the Obama White House, working for President Obama and then Vice President Biden.
So you are in the know, the perfect person to talk to. Carri, welcome to The Take. Democrats appear to be on quite the high right now. Vice President Kamala Harris and her new running mate, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, have formally kicked off their 2024 presidential race, and that has only amped up the buzz already surrounding Harris. When was the last time you saw the Democratic Party this energized?
You know, I don't know that I've seen this party so energized in such a uniform way, a kind of across demographic, really since 2008.
Hello, Chicago!
President Obama's re-election campaign was quite tough. Hillary Clinton obviously animated and excited huge segments of the Democratic Party, but not in the same sort of holistic, comprehensive way that we're seeing Vice President Kamala Harris really energize folks.
What does that look like? What do you mean when you say holistic? Because it also feels like 2008 to me. I covered lots of campaigns, and remembering the size of the crowds and the electric feeling of being in those crowds, it feels like that online right now. But you say this sounds like it's even more unified. What does that mean?
Well, I think that we're seeing her perform and energize multiple different segments of the Democratic Party, right? People are Democrats for a lot of different reasons. It's the big tent party. You have people who care about ecological, environmental justice, people who care about seeing the first woman president, people who care about education or taxes or foreign policy, all the various reasons that people select Democrats. We're seeing excitement and enthusiasm and massive increases in engagement across the board for people who are there for different reasons, and that happens very rarely. The beauty and the curse of the Democratic Party is that sort of quilt-like pastiche of different groups, which means each different election cycle, we can cobble together a different coalition depending on who is at the top of the ticket. But we're seeing her really perform across the board in a way that I don't think I've seen since 2008. And I wasn't sure it was going to happen again.
Okay, so that explains why we saw these calls that turned into fundraising calls and raised millions. Black women for Kamala, white women for Kamala, white dudes for Kamala, Latinx for Kamala, et cetera. The list goes on. We didn't see that kind of support for Biden. Do they have different bases? What accounts for that?
Well, we did see that support for Biden, just not organized in the same way, right? Those calls exist. That's a fundamental organizing principle of the Democratic Party, is these sort of affinity group organizing modalities. But they didn't get the excitement, they didn't get the hype, they didn't get the volume, they didn't get nearly the amount of juice, so to speak, for Biden as they have for Kamala Harris, but they did exist. And so I think that's part and parcel of the narrative that's coming out of this wave of enthusiasm and momentum, is the scale at which she's been able to organize and animate people in such quick fashion, right? Those calls, you're talking about 50, 60, 75,000 people, waiting lists of thousands of people trying to get into the Zooms that were organized in 24 and 48 hours.
Wow. Were you on any of them?
I was laying in bed at like 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. in Europe for the Black Women for Kamala call. And what was so telling to me, and this is anecdotal, but I know that it's echoed for a lot of people, is I was getting invited to that on text threads from women in my life who I don't even talk about politics with. And they were sort of like, get on the call, be there. And it was like, sis, I'm already, like, I'll be there. Like, don't worry about me. But it was really beautiful to watch how so quickly sort of pervaded communities that are already organized.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that's really valuable, it also signaled to other groups across community that there was solidarity and allyship. So seeing 50,000 white dudes organize themselves and take it upon themselves to show up and stand alongside Black women and Latinos and Black men was a really beautiful thing. And I think is an important harbinger for that kind of enthusiasm and that kind of massive coalition building that Kamala Harris is doing.
So let's talk about how that buzz has only morphed to perhaps extend to even more people because of Kamala Harris's vice president pick. So there had been heated discourse around all of the reported VP picks, all done in pretty record time, given the short notice of the job opening. And compared to others that were in the running, Walz is the most progressive option. And he went viral before he was selected, calling Donald Trump and J.D. Vance weird.
Well, it's true. These guys are just weird. And they're running for He-Man Women Haters Club or something. That's what they go at. That's not what people are interested in.
He said it again this week at a rally. How did that comment play, and what do you make of it?
Well, a message is only as important as the messenger, right? And I think Tim Walz is speaking from a place of very genuine authenticity when he's calling out people for being aberrant to sort of what we consider values of Americans. And so I think that could have been really condescending and patronizing had it come from the wrong messenger. But he's sort of like, theoretically, these guys and I are the same. We all check the same boxes on the census form, and yet we couldn't be more different. Like, these guys are not reflective of me, of my values, of my town, of my state. But I think it's also what it was so successful because it's what we're all thinking. It's actually the plainest, sort of most elegant, simplest way of describing what so much of the base and so many just not even politically engaged people think and feel when they're watching some of the rhetoric that comes from J.D. Vance and Donald Trump. You're sort of like, that's a weird thing to say. It's a weird thing to do. It's like, that's what I've been trying to say all these years.
Carri, you've been in politics for a long time now. How unusual is this? Because it's a long way off from former First Lady Michelle Obama's "when they go low, we go high." This is not something we typically see from the Democratic Party. So, yeah, what do you make of that shift?
Well, I think that this is an exercise in positionality, and Tim Walz's positionality within his demographic gives him a privilege to say something that Michelle Obama can't say. She just can't. And we can break down all the reasons why, but I think they're fairly obvious and self-evident. And
race, gender, Yeah. So you made that connection with the campaign of former President Barack Obama. And so I wonder what you make of something else we saw around his presidency and his campaign. And it was that extremely vitriolic, racist statements coming from the Republican Party, coming from Donald Trump. We've seen that again directed at Vice President Harris. Does anything feel like it's changed since the days of 2008?
I think a lot's changed. I think that the fact that we are having kind of race-baiting conversations out in the open is a massive change. In 2008, yes, it was happening. Yes, we saw the rise of the Tea Party, but the Tea Party itself was falling all over itself to say it wasn't about race, right? Republicans were falling all over themselves to recruit young Black conservatives to be the face people of the Tea Party, of the campaign, because they didn't want to be accused of racism. Now people wear that as a flag. Now there's a total lack of shame around racism. But listen, being a Black person in this country, like, this is not surprising. There's nothing anyone can say to Kamala Harris, a Black woman who has been public facing for 2 decades, who has lived in America her entire life, there's nothing you can say that she hasn't heard that would catch her flat-footed.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it might trip up the campaign, some of the staffers on the campaign who might do a little pearl clutching, but these elected officials are seasoned, they're battle-tested. There is nothing Donald Trump can say to Kamala Harris that will surprise her. And when we saw him at the NABJ, it's not surprising that the Black audience laughed at him. They weren't gasping in shock. They laughed because it's like, my guy, like, what are you doing?
Yeah. And this is the National Association of Black Journalists Conference.
Yes.
In which he got on stage and said things like, oh, I didn't know she was Black.
I've known her a long time indirectly, not directly very much. And she was always of Indian heritage, and she was only promoting Indian heritage. I didn't know she was Black until a number of years ago when she happened to turn Black, and now she wants to be known as Black. So I don't know, is she Indian or is she Black?
And so that audience literally laughed in his face because you can't surprise Black people with racism. Like, we've been here too long. We've seen too much. We know, we have the receipts. This is not shocking. This is not new to us. And so I think it's much more scandalous to other people who want to believe that this didn't exist the entire time. But for us, it's sort of like, this is, he's shown us who he is. We know exactly who he is. Sure.
So, Carri, we saw Tim Walz make his first appearance as Harris's vice presidential candidate on Tuesday. Did you watch?
Of course, yeah.
They stood on stage together at a rally of more than 14,000 people in the U.S. swing state of Pennsylvania.
Oh, it is good to be back in Pennsylvania.
It's the largest rally of the Harris campaign so far, which is still in its infancy stages, of course. And Harris introduced him as the vice president that America deserves.
He's the kind of person who makes people feel like they belong and then inspires them to dream big. And that's the kind of vice president he will be. And that's the kind of vice president America deserves.
What does Walz bring to the campaign trail and to the role of potential future vice president?
What we've seen him do in Minnesota, instituting universal free school lunch and breakfast, extending tax credits for children and working families, cutting childhood poverty by 1/3, protecting and enshrining access to abortion and reproductive justice rights, ecological advancement and environmental policies. Over and over again, he's been unapologetic about his very progressive policy agenda. And whoever is president next is going to have a very full slate from foreign policy, whether it's the war in Ukraine, Israel's war in Gaza. We are going to have a president whose attention is diverted outside of the United States. And so to have a vice president, to have a number two who not only has walked the walk and talked the talk of what it means to take care of these kitchen table domestic policy issues, but has spent time in Congress, has been able to build relationships across the aisle in both houses, he'll be able to shepherd an ongoing policy agenda domestically when, President Harris has to be at the G7 or wherever she'll be.
After the break, excitement is one thing, but will voters see significant change when it comes to things like foreign policy? So, Carri, Biden's campaign was met with criticism because of his policies and his rhetoric on Israel and Gaza. What makes Harris's different, and what do we know about Tim Walz's record on this topic and what he would bring to it? Because there was a lot of consternation ahead of her pick on who she would pick when it came to this issue.
The reality is that there is not a ton of substantive policy differentiation between Democrats. There are, however, very substantive rhetorical differences. There is frameworks and I think perspectives of how they see what is unfolding that are really different, and that can then lead down the road to different policy outcomes. But, Kamala Harris, while she rhetorically was very quick before the administration, she was the highest ranking administration official to call for a ceasefire, to point out the very real humanitarian crisis that Israel was creating.
What has happened in Gaza over the past 9 months is devastating. The images of dead children and desperate, hungry people fleeing for safety, sometimes displaced for the second, third, or fourth time. We cannot look away in the face of these tragedies. We cannot allow ourselves to become numb to the suffering, and I will not be silent.
Tim Walz has also been critical of the way that the humanitarian crisis has both unfolded but also been neglected, and has been communicative during the primary season, if people remember, of the tens of thousands of Minnesota voters who, in an act of protest, submitted uncommitted ballots.
I think you see the president talking about a need to have a lasting two-state solution, the need to relieve the humanitarian crisis that's in Gaza, while also recognizing Israel's right to exist. So I think those folks were expressing a democratic frustration. That's healthy.
And that is a rhetorical difference that is really important and meaningful and could ladder up to policy change. But, when he was in Congress, he took pro-Israel votes. I don't know that it is a reasonable expectation to expect a massive departure from any previous American administration, regardless of who is elected. But how they talk about it and the way that rhetoric puts pressure on the Israeli government to conduct themselves in certain ways or hastens an end to the active conflict, I think is what is significant.
Well, finally, Carri, with less than 100 days to go before the election, that can seem like not a lot of time, and yet so much can happen. So it's a long road until we actually get to inauguration. What are your fears or hopes for this time period? What should we be looking out for?
The problem is that we always we sort of get our attention and our animatedness around politics in these short windows right before Election Day, while there's an entire well-resourced operation and opposition that has been systematically undermining the very structure of American voting for years. We've watched this legal apparatus on the right infiltrate states like Pennsylvania, Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, with elected officials and with elections officials who are solely focused on reelecting Donald Trump, not with election integrity, not with democratizing access to the ballot, but with limiting it to their voters. And that's very real. I mean, billions of dollars is being spent this election cycle on those efforts. And I think it's difficult to talk about. It's scary to talk about. It's also really technical. And so we don't pay a ton of attention to it, but it's very real and it's incredibly threatening. I think that America got exceedingly comfortable and quit paying attention to what was happening in its civic life. And that is how you get a Donald Trump. And that is how you wind up in these intractable policy positions that you don't agree with, that vast majority of the country does not agree with, because we quit paying attention. We took our eye off the ball. And the reality is you have to pay attention to politics every single day. We can eat organic and we can meditate and drink water and carry around our Stanley cups and do all of this stuff. But if you're not paying attention to your civic health as well, then all of that can come crumbling down really fast.
And that's The Take. This episode was produced by Chloe K. Lee, Tamara Khandaker, and Sonia Bhagat, with Manahil Naveed, Amy Walters, Doha Mosaad, Veronique Ishaya, and me, Malika Bilal. It was edited by Noor Wazwaz. Our sound designer is Alex Roldan. Alexandra Locke is The Take's executive producer, and Ney Alvarez is Al Jazeera's head of audio. We'll be back tomorrow.